Okay, so for chapter 3, Molecules of Life, I'm actually going to do more than just an introduction. I'm going to kind of do an overview of the whole chapter using the PowerPoint from the textbook that we use. So here we have the learning objectives for this chapter, and we're really looking at macromolecules and what they mean for our bodies, right? What they mean for our health. The last chapter we talked about, the chemistry of biology and how the elements, how the atoms, what they mean on their own and what they mean when they come together to form molecules and compounds, those substances, right, that we need in our bodies. So this is really looking at the bigger molecules, the macro, right? Micro means small, macro means bigger. So let's see how we use these and what they are. So we're looking at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Okay, and here it talks about our food is made up of organic molecules. So the term organic here that we use it is just basically it has carbon and hydrogen. So organic means that in its simplest form. When you're talking about growing food organically, that's different. So that can be addressed in another chapter. But here we have all of these have both carbon and hydrogen in them. And what I want you to remember is from chapter 2, I talked about there are 4 elements that make up 96% of the mass of our bodies. And think about those 4 things, right? The carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, because you're going to see these as part of what makes up these macromolecules. So it makes sense, right? These are what we intake for our nutrition, and this is what we're made up of. All right, so the first category, carbohydrates. So right there, if you look at the word carbo, like you're thinking carbon, maybe you are, and hydrate, so hydrate, hydro, water. So we're going to have some H2O in there, right? H and O and some carbon in there. So yeah, this is our primary source of fuel. We know, and this will be in the next slide, the simplest form of it being glucose. And glucose is what needs to drive our cellular respiration system that we have. And that's how basically our body creates energy so that we can do anything. And this is why it's really important to get our carbohydrates. So it just kind of depends on what kinds of food you're getting your fuel from. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So a monosaccharide, saccharide meaning sugar, mono meaning one, right? You probably know that. Those are your simple sugars. And whether you're getting in your diet simple sugars or more complex sugars, it's all going to be broken down into that glucose in its simplest forms or just simpler forms of sugar, so your body can utilize it readily. Even though these are part of our macromolecules, these are the smaller macros, right? Here we have glucose, and if you notice here, check this out, we have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, all in the same ratios, 6, 12, 6. And they're just, if you look, the difference between glucose, fructose, and I believe this is galactose behind here, you're going to notice that they're just bonded differently, right? There's different shapes, there's different ways they are bonded. And that basically makes a whole new structure just because they're bonded in a different way. And another thing you'll notice, anything ending in ose, O-S-E, if you see that, hey, that's a sugar, okay? So that's another little clue. And when you see bonds, right, we talked about this in chapter 2, anytime you see bonding, that's like looking at something going, there's a lot of energy in that. So the more bonds you see and the stronger bonds you see, you know that there's more energy that we can actually get from that molecule. So keep that in mind. Do this. So glucose. We take in our food, and that glucose becomes a part of that, the sugar that's in our blood. So blood sugar. And when maybe you hear about that with diabetics talking about blood sugar, or even people who, if they have low blood sugar, maybe they're in a bad mood because they're hungry. It just affects people in different ways. So when that glucose molecule is readily available in the blood and we exercise, it's great because it can just, incorporate that, and we can use it right away for that cellular respiration, so creating that energy in that process. So, however, if we take in food that we don't utilize right away, those molecules, that glucose becoming that blood sugar, if we don't use it, then it's going to need to be stored, right? And so there's kind of a temporary storage, a short-term storage, which is glycogen. So it basically forms chains and hold it and store it. It's kind of like putting a bunch of stuff on the shelf, right? Maybe stacking cans on top of one another. And so you can go into that and get your can off the shelf, right? So it's the difference between glucose being just like your food being right there on the table, easily accessed, or maybe it's on a shelf in your kitchen, stacked in cans, and so it takes a little bit of work to get in there, open the can, right? So that's going to take a little bit more energy to access that energy. It's going to take energy to access the energy. And then this longer, and that's going to be like in your muscles and, where does it say? Muscles and liver, I think. And then when you look at long-term energy storage, now you're talking about glucose being turned into fat, okay? So here's this, converted to fat. So it's kind of like when you store your extra food down in the basement, and then it takes a lot more work to go down there and get it and get that going. So those are different forms of storage, how we access glucose. I thought this was really interesting, and I'm not sure to what degree I really knew of this, but so we have that glycogen, right, that temporary storage, and our body's going after that when we start exercising, and it uses up the blood, the sugar in the blood right away, and then it needs to go to something else. Well, if you have a pound of glycogen, and that pound of glycogen has 4 pounds of water molecules, right, attached here. And this is just how the molecules bond to it. So when people lose weight right away, when they start exercising or dieting, that's that water weight that they're talking about. So still the whole glycogen molecule is there. It's just that you lost that water weight. So that's why you have to kind of push past that. It's going to slow down a little bit, the weight loss is, but push past it, because eventually you're going to get to burning that fat. So carbohydrates. So not only do we have monosaccharides, one, we have disaccharides. Di means 2. So we have lactose, sucrose, and this sucrose here made up of glucose and fructose, right? That together makes basically table sugar, right? So that is a disaccharide. And then you have the complex carbohydrates, and that's going to be things like your starch, right? And there's complex carbohydrate starch. It's going to be that. It's going to be a lot more bonded together. So poly means several, right? Several sugars. So several sugars linked together, bonded together. So it's going to take more energy to split them apart, and it's going to provide more energy. So it's kind of like takes more energy to access it, but it's going to provide you more energy in the long run. Short-term versus long-term energy. So you eat that cupcake, you talk about the sugar high, at a birthday party with a bunch of kids. Well, that's true, because it's this simple sugar. It can be broken up really quickly and accessed right away. So it does, kind of give you that burst of energy, or that burst of access to that. And then but if you want to think long term, right, you need energy to last a while, then there's other foods that are more complex that will serve you better, right? Here's some hummus. We don't want to keep shocking our body into these spikes in sugar in our blood. It just isn't a healthy way. It's not very good for our organs. So we have other carbohydrates in the form of chitin, this is here, and then you think about your shell shelled animals like lobster and crabs, that hard shell, right, that's chitin. So that's not digestible to us. Cellulose, here you have a picture of, this is a close-up of the chains of sugars in plants. That is not digestible to us as well. And something interesting though is when you think of something like a termite and all they eat is wood, right? You're like, what the heck? How come they can digest it? Well, they actually have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, right? A particular type of bacteria that actually helps to digest that wood, and we don't have that particular bacteria, even though the majority of our cells in our body are bacterial and not human cells. Conversation for a different time. I just think it's super cool. And then you have that whole idea of, so then why are people like, you know, you have to eat the plants, you know, because it's good for you, all that fiber. Well, it is. To eat that non-digestible food means that it's going to move through you. So sometimes it's called roughage, and that really helps to clear your digestive tract, right? It's going to help kind of scrape the walls and take things out. And they have found that it actually reduces your risk for colon cancer and other diseases if you can have a good diet where you are clearing things out and things aren't sitting in there forever, right? If you eat a bunch of meat or something, it's just going to take so long to digest. It's really, you know, a good idea to follow it up with salad. And another interesting thing I heard in some countries, I want to say France, I want to say I heard France, but other countries, instead of eating their salad first, like in the United States, it seems like all restaurants will serve you that salad first. It actually makes more sense to eat the salad at the end of a meal. So chew on that. Okay. Lipids. So these macromolecules, they actually have so many bonds that it's a huge amount of stored energy. So you're kind of like, great, cool, huge amount of stored energy, yeah. Well, but you know, you have to go through the glucose in the blood, and then the glycogen, and then you get to burning that fat. Insoluble in water, so in means not soluble in water. Hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So hydro, you're seeing that word again, so you're thinking hydrogen, you're thinking water. Phobic, when you have a phobia, so you have a fear of something, and philic actually it means like love. So there are, so lipids are hydrophobic, right? And you know this because you have had cases where you have tried to shake up like a dressing where there's oil and water, or you see an oil spill on the news, right? So water doesn't help take apart, it doesn't help disassociate or dismantle lipids. When you have a water molecule and you have the oxygen bonded with two hydrogen, oxygen has a lot more protons than hydrogen. So when you have them sharing electrons, or they bond together from a covalent bond, because opposites attract and you have more protons in the oxygen element part of that molecule, it's going to pull the electrons a little closer to it. So that oxygen part of the water molecule has a little bit more of a negative charge, which leaves a little bit more of a positive charge on those two hydrogens. But those are polar, right? Water is a polar molecule. So lipids don't dissolve or dissociate in water. Greasy to the touch. These are the kinds of lipids. Fats, which you've heard of, sterols, and phospholipids. We have fats, or sometimes they're called triglycerides, but triglycerides actually incorporates the fats and oils. So here we have a glycerol head, okay, so the head region, the hydrophilic, and this part of this actually is philic, so it loves water, so that piece of it can react with water, but most of it is phobic, right? The fatty acid tail is phobic. And look at though, if you look at all these bonds in here, these carbon to hydrogen, these little gray dots are your hydrogen. Whoa, there's a ton of energy. You can look at that and see that chemical energy that's there. Fat molecules contain much more stored energy than carbohydrate molecules. True story, we already talked about that. Just have to be careful what we eat. Oh, this was interesting though. So because fats have more energy, we as human beings throughout time have evolved to desire fat more because fat back in primitive days wasn't very available. Like it was harder to obtain fat, right? So we evolved to really crave fat because we really needed it in our diet. But the problem is now fat is everywhere, and unfortunately we still have this strong desire for fat. Saturation, maybe you know that word, when something's filled to the capacity of something. So that just means that everywhere a hydrogen can bond with a carbon, it has done it. Okay, so it's saturated, and it makes for these very rigid, straight lines. Then you have unsaturated. So that basically means where there are places where it could have had a hydrogen bond, but instead there's something else. And here you have a double bonded carbon with a double bonded carbon. So it makes this kink in that row. And so then the rows can't align really tightly next to one another. And so it basically allows for these to be digested a little easier. And so you get these from oils, olive oil, fish oil, right? Not straight up fish, but fish oil. But these are our good fats. We have to eat good fat. Whether it's avocados, that's another one that has good fat. It's very important. And then trans fat, so that's an interesting one. They actually found a way to chemically alter an unsaturated fat. So they take these kinks and they're like, well, we're going to force hydrogen into those kinks. And that's what they did. And it kind of helped to straighten that out, which makes those oiled fats more rigid. So you take something like, a plant oil and you make it into like a margarine. Okay, so now it's more solid. It's not quite as solid as a stick of butter, dairy butter. So people love the taste of trans fat. They make food taste better. And like when you put it in your mouth, it's more likely to melt easier. So there's a real draw to use these. The problem is these aren't very healthy for us. So our body, it's harder for them to break these down. But once again, everything in moderation. So we have to be careful of these trans fats as well. So you hear about cholesterol too, like the good and the bad cholesterol. And yeah, you can get those numbers looked at when you go to the doctor, and that's a good idea. These can be very important. They actually, when they're in the phospholipid membrane, which you'll see next, that is a protective layer that's around our cells, and it actually helps our cells from getting too liquidy and from getting too hardened. So cholesterol is very important for keeping our cells fluid, but not too fluid around that outer edge. So here's a problem though. So plaque, it contains cholesterol, but it also is like calcium and fats all kind of combined, and it creates this, if you have too much cholesterol in your diet, and so it kind of too many bad fats and stuff in your diet too, and it makes this plaque. You might have heard of that, like in your arteries, and then that can be what leads to heart attack or stroke. So we have to be really careful of that hardening. And then steroids. So estrogen, testosterone, and they have so many functions in our body related to sex production, but also development and maturation of cells and muscle growth, etc. And you have, when people misuse testosterone, you've seen that before, where they are taking synthetic. So synthetic means human-made, man-made, human-made molecules, but it has so many drawbacks, right? That roid rage, as they talk about. But there's a lot of there's a lot of bad things that happen with taking testosterone if you're not under doctor's care for some kind of condition, right? And then estrogen as well. Sometimes estrogen is prescribed by doctors, but you have to be under doctor's care. Unfortunately, so estrogen and testosterone are found in both sexes. Unfortunately, estrogen is something where we are finding estrogen mimicking chemicals, and we'll talk about that in another chapter. But all plastics have chemicals in them, so combinations, like everything's chemicals, right? It's not like chemicals are bad, like everything's made up of chemicals. But estrogen, a chemical in itself. But we have human-made chemicals, right, plastics, that they mimic estrogen. So let's say you leave your water bottle in the car and it heats up, and the plastic chemicals, the chemicals in plastic go into your water, and you drink that water later, you are then getting some of those chemicals that actually our body thinks is estrogen. So there's fertilizers that do that, and some pesticides. There's all kinds of things that we're exposed to that our body is looking at and going, oh, it's more estrogen, cool. So that's what's likely led to a lot of different cancers when our body is kind of overloaded with estrogen, even though it's not actually estrogen. Or it blocks estrogen from actually doing its job because it's this pseudo or false estrogen. Phospholipids. So that phosphol, so there's going to be something with like phosphate or phosphorus, something happens to be phosphate. So it's going to be a part of it, right? So I talked about that. It's on the outside of our cells. It actually is a protective bilayer, so two-layer in many, things in our body. So the tail is that fatty acid. There's two, right? And it's hydrophobic. So as you can see, it's aligned in the middle. So here's water. So you have the hydrophilic heads, so water-loving heads here. And so they kind of align, so it can interact with the water, but the tails do not have an affinity to water. So they all, if you were to just take a bunch of phospholipids and throw them together in a bottle of water, you'd actually see them, all the tails kind of come together and all the heads go on the outside. Right? And then waxes. Those are lipids as well. So, you may have used different kinds of waxes. Maybe it's in some of your makeups and, lip stuff. You see water being repelled off of ducts of waterfowl, so you know that there's a wax component in their feathers. And then proteins. As you can see, proteins help with everything: structure, protection, right? It fights against invading organisms, pathogens, right? COVID. It regulates our body, contraction, transportation. Proteins do so many things. So what are they? Proteins, those building blocks, are amino acids. So basically, you've heard of amino acids, right? It's kind of like that idea of like the alphabet again. So instead of 26 letters, we have 20, right? And here are, just see if you can find some names. Here's some names. Alanine, glycine. So you'll see a lot of them that have the INE at the end. Leucine. So there's all these amino acids. And basically what they are, as you can see, they're going to have a certain chemical makeup that we then say, oh, these particular molecules look like this if it's in the category of a protein. So once again, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Look at those four things that make up most of our body, right here, those elements. So in that, it has this carboxyl group here, and you can see the oxygen and carbon, and the bonds you can see because you know what all these lines mean, the bonding. And then you have the amino group, okay, which consists of the nitrogen and hydrogens. And then you have a side chain. Here's where they're different. So we know it's a protein because we see this, and we see, oh, there's also a side chain. So every amino acid has a different side chain. So there's 20 different side chains. Okay, so 20 different amino acids, and that just means, whatever the atoms are over on this side. So, so there in our diets, there are complete proteins and incomplete proteins. So one thing is like our body, as you can see now, all of these molecules are made up of different atoms, right? And they're constructed in various ways. And then when they, our body can take those and dismantle them, or, take them apart basically, and then rebuild molecules we need. So some of our amino acids can be built from things that are already in our body, but some cannot. So they're called essential amino acids. So you have to get them from your diet. So think about all the people who don't get complete diets, right? You're talking about maybe people in third world countries, or just people on a very that have very poor diets in any country. Maybe people don't understand that you have to have all these atoms, in some combination in your body to function properly, in all these amino acids and all the different carbohydrates we talked about, and the different ways we get fats in our body that are good fats. So when you're talking about people who don't have access to good food, now you're inviting in all these different health complications and health problems. And maybe you don't notice it when you're younger, but over time, right? Sometimes I feel like I didn't have the best nutrition, not for lack of my parents trying, but I was a very picky eater. Well, complete protein, that particular food would have all the essential amino acids, all those amino acids you have to get from your diet. So, and you can see some here. It's hard for me to read. It's really small on my screen, but what do we have here? Okay, so you have milk. Now there are I believe a lot of downsides to animal products. I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan. In fact, they have to be really careful with getting everything they need, because the easiest way to get all your amino acids are from some animal products, like you see here, milk. Right? You get all the essential amino acids. So maybe that's why milk is one of those things that's often given to for the free or reduced programs for food for kids, because it is an easy way. So all my vegan friends out there, we really have to understand that sometimes it's a matter of, maybe people don't understand the whole dairy production and how animals are treated and all that, but people need to be healthy as well. So, and milk is just one of those fast ways to get it to somebody. But here we have tofu, and that has all the essential amino acids, and just have to be careful where you get your tofu and your soy and all of that, right? There's better products and not good products of all of these, right? Chicken, great, but chicken that's raised in a very healthy way is going to be healthier for our bodies, etc. But then you have some, here's apples, and it doesn't have quite those. So if you can't access, or you don't want to have animal products, you have to really study and do a combination of foods to get all your essential amino acids. So they're called complementary proteins. So like it mentioned in the book, like in Mexico, they eat corn and beans, and those together kind of give you a lot of those essential. In India, it was lentils and rice, and then it was saying southern U.S. states, black-eyed peas and, was it rice? I think it was rice as well. So sometimes meals are made up of a combination of things that get you all those proteins. So this lighting is really driving me crazy. Let me do this. Let me see if I can turn this around to get some lighting over here. I've been sitting for a while. Okay, I feel like I should be like giving you a haunted house tour. Ooh. All right, there's some daylight up there. Still light. I need some what do you call it? Skylights. That'd be really cool. So, all right, so a protein. We'll look into later how our bodies make these long chains of amino acids to make proteins, but it's kind of like this little factory in our cells, and they produce these little chains of amino acids. Well, once those chains come out, right? So maybe it's leucine with glycine, and I don't know all my amino acids offhand real quick here, but they're connected, right? And they do this, they get a message from the DNA that goes to the RNA and tells the cell like what it needs, tells our body like what particular protein do you need? Do you need to fix skin that's been cut? Is something wrong with your liver? Maybe you're growing a baby. Like, what is it that we need to produce to help this system? So it comes out in this chain, and then because I think this lighting is just terrible, because the different atoms, right? The different atoms in those molecules, or in that molecule that those amino acids, they will attract to each other in different ways, right? Depending on if they're polar or non-polar, or how they're bonded, etc. So they start to fold in toward one another, and eventually, they have this secondary structure, and then you have a tertiary structure. So if you're familiar with that word, that's kind of like the leveling up. So then we have all this, and it kind of looks a little bit globular here. And then you have this quaternary structure. So that's when two or more polypeptide chains bond together. So polypeptide. So they're amino acids that are strung together. The bond between them is called a peptide bond. So that's why many together is called a polypeptide. Okay. So when you have many amino acids together that form proteins, it's called a polypeptide. So remember that. And yeah, two polypeptides bonded together, two or more, is going to be your quaternary structure. So something about proteins, the shape of a protein denotes or predicts, or I can't think of the word for it, but it tells you what its function is going to be. So if the shape of the protein is ruined, is denatured, so destroyed, taken apart, changed, then that protein doesn't have the function anymore. Enzymes are a type of protein in general. And what they do is they help to speed reactions up. Okay, so it's the catalyst. It's kind of like if you were on a hill and you're going sledding, and so if any of you have ever gone sledding, and you are kind of moving your body back and forth because you can't get the sled to start down the hill, right? It's kind of like if somebody went behind you and gave you a push. It's kind of like that push. So you would have to use less energy trying to get yourself started down that hill because somebody else put in that energy. So it lowers the amount of energy you have to put in. And that's what enzymes do. It lowers the amount of energy that a function, a metabolic process in our body has to use. Another thing I like to say is if you've ever been skiing, you have a ski lift. The ski lift is kind of like the enzyme. Okay, so here in this picture, if you look, you have lactose, a substrate, right? It's made up of galactose and glucose. It's a disaccharide, two sugars together. And here's the enzyme that's going to help speed up the process of breaking them apart. So, and this enzyme happens to be called lactase. So you have lactose, os denotes a sugar. Lactase, most enzymes have the ACE ending, not all. So ASE, but when you see that, you think enzyme. So that's why they sell those little pills of lactase for lactose intolerant people. So you can have this in your body to help break apart lactose. So here's our ski lift, right? And then here comes the skiers. They're gonna sit down in that ski lift. And there's a perfect little spot for them, this active site. And it fits their bodies pretty well. Not perfectly, but it's definitely meant for them, right? And they get in there, and through a chemical magical process, they are broken apart. Okay, so And then there you have glucose and galactose go their own way, just like skiers. Like you get on the ski lift together, but when you get off, you go your separate ways. So an enzyme, or it can go the other way. You can have two molecules come together and join in an enzyme. Like if, like two people getting on the ski lift, and maybe they get off the ski lift hand in hand and they go down together. Or it's kind of like divorce court, or, like you have the court, and the court doesn't change, just like that ski lift doesn't change. The court doesn't change, but you can go in there and get married, right? You join together, or you can go in there and get divorced, split apart. But the court can keep doing that over and over and over. The ski lift can keep taking skiers over and over, just like the enzyme. The enzyme typically doesn't go away and can do the same reaction over and over and over. So that's activation energy. Kind of talk to you a little bit about that. It lowers that activation energy that the process would need without enzyme. But some things can get in the way of that. You can also denature enzymes, and some of the problems there could be if you don't have enough enzyme and substrate. So the substrate what was coming in, right? That lactose was the substrate, and the enzyme was where it was coming into. So maybe there's not enough of one or the other. So the concentration of that, the temperature. So typically, if you warm up a reaction, the molecules move faster and they bump together more, and it actually speeds up the reaction. Light there. But if it gets too hot, then it can denature. It can ruin the whole thing, right? Too much heat and the enzyme won't work anymore. And then pH, right? So there's a pH range that all metabolic processes prefer, right, or work best under. And if it's too acidic or too basic, that can be a problem. And then the presence of inhibitors or activators. So it just depends. There's other things that can actually help enzymes or slow them down or actually tell the process to stop. And when you think about the other things we need in our diet, like zinc, all those other things that we hear about in the minerals and things we need, they actually, in vitamins, they can actually help in these processes to be an activator. Sometimes medicines, but oh my gosh, get your cat butt out of my way. It's always her butt that's in these pictures. I think she's offended because she jumped down. So yeah, it can basically also cause, it has a picture here, the inhibitors can slow down processes too. It can get in the way of, it can ruin the process that is supposed to be going on, like the estrogen mimicking chemicals I told you about, right? So if a chemical from plastic goes somewhere where estrogen is supposed to go, then it actually is going to shut down, the system that is supposed to take place, or it's going to change it. So incorrect amino acid sequence. Okay, so if the protein is built wrong with the wrong amino acids, that can actually lead to disease because the protein isn't going to fold correctly and it's not going to function correctly. Prions, like mad cow disease, if you're interested, look into that. Great. I can't remember the one. Can't remember it, but it's a disease that cannibals sometimes would get from eating like the brain portion. Super interesting. I'll try to find my video on that. Not one I made. It's one that I found on the internet from some documentary. So there are some diseases that if a prion is a misfolded protein, and that can actually lead to disease in that way as well. Last part, nucleotides. So those are our nucleic acids, macromolecules. So those DNA, RNA, store our information. They're kind of like our cookbook of all the recipes of what's needed in our body, or all the recipes for all those proteins that we are talking about. And then the RNA is kind of like helps as a translator. So if your cells have that nucleus and the DNA is kept in that nucleus, it's kind of like the cookbook kept in the kitchen, and you can't take that cookbook out of the kitchen, so you have to go in there and you have to write down the recipe. That's kind of like your RNA is writing that down. So we'll talk about that in detail in another chapter.